On a shelf in an American kitchen right now, there is a box of cereal with a signature printed on the front. W.K. Kellogg. It has been there for over a century in the same looping, handwritten script, promising the buyer that this is the real thing, the original, not one of the dozens of copies crowding the shelf beside it. Almost nobody who picks up that box has ever heard the name John Harvey Kellogg. And that is strange, because John Harvey Kellogg is the man who actually invented what is inside it. He held the patents, he ran the laboratory, he was, by any fair accounting, the mind behind the flake, and a court of law once ordered that his own name could appear on his own invention only in tiny print, tucked into a corner, dwarfed by his younger brother's signature. Two brothers built the most famous breakfast in the history of the world, out of the same kitchen, from the same idea. One of them got his name on the box in letters 6 inches tall, the other got a court order telling him how small his own name was allowed to be. So, ask the obvious question. If John Harvey Kellogg invented the thing, why does history remember someone else's signature? The easy answer is the one everybody reaches for first. Two brothers, one invention, one of them got greedy, and family blood turned into a courtroom war. It makes a tidy story. It is also not quite the truth, or at least not the interesting part of it. Because what happened between these two men was not really a fight over an idea. Ideas, it turns out, were the cheapest thing in Battle Creek, Michigan in 1900. What was expensive, what was actually worth fighting a decade in court for, was something else entirely, something almost nobody watching from the outside understood was the real prize. And once you see what that prize was, you will never look at a brand name the same way again. Start with the man who had the idea in the first place, because his story is the part everyone skips past to get to the lawsuit. John Harvey Kellogg was a doctor, and not an ordinary one. He took over a small Seventh-day Adventist health clinic in Battle Creek in 1876 and turned it into something the country had never seen, a combination of hospital, spa, and temple to clean living, where the guests included industrialists, senators, and the occasional president. He called it the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and everyone else just called it the San. Kellogg preached vegetarianism, exercise, and a diet stripped of anything he considered filth, and he backed the preaching with real invention. He held patents on peanut butter, on soy milk, on meat substitutes made from wheat gluten that patients called, without much affection, protos. He built exercise machines from scratch. He was, without exaggeration, one of the most original minds in American medicine at the turn of the century. And in 1894, working late with his younger brother, he left a batch of boiled wheat sitting out for almost 2 days, ran the stale dough through a set of rollers, and baked what came out. It flaked. It crunched. The patients liked it. That accident is the ancestor of every bowl of cereal poured in America since. The younger brother in that kitchen was named Will. Will Keith Kellogg had spent years as John Harvey's bookkeeper and business manager at the San, a quiet, taciturn man permanently standing in the shadow of a famous flamboyant older brother who barely acknowledged him. But Will saw something in that flake his brother never did. He saw a product, not a treatment for hospital patients. A product for every kitchen table in the country. He wanted to sell it, brand it, advertise it, and sell it to people who had never set foot in a sanitarium in their lives. John Harvey resisted for years. To him, the flake was medicine, a tool for reforming the American gut, not a commodity to be hawked in grocery stores. That single disagreement over what the invention actually was, a treatment or a product, is the seed everything else grew from. While the brothers argued, somebody else was already taking notes. A patient checked into the San in the early 1890s named Charles William Post, a failed businessman who had suffered a nervous breakdown and come to Battle Creek looking for a cure. He could not afford to pay his bill, so as part of his stay, he worked it off in the kitchen. He watched, he tasted, he learned the recipes the San was feeding its guests, the roasted grain coffee substitutes, the flaked cereals, the whole quiet science of it. When he left, cured or not, he had something else with him. Within a few years, he launched his own products out of the same town, a coffee substitute he called Postum and a cereal called Grape Nuts. John Harvey Kellogg would spend the rest of his life insisting to anyone who would listen that Post had simply walked out of his kitchen with his ideas. That claim has never been settled, and it never will be, but notice what it proves regardless of who is right. The idea itself, the actual recipe, was never the treasure everyone assumed it was. It was sitting out in the open, in a hospital kitchen, available to any patient who could not pay his bill and happened to be paying attention. 3 men built 3 fortunes on some version of the same flake. Only one of them was family. So if the idea was not the treasure, what was? Watch what Will Kellogg actually spent his money on once he finally got his brother to let him build the business. Not more research, not more patents. Advertising. Will Kellogg poured money into newspaper campaigns with a scale nobody in the cereal trade had ever attempted. One line told readers to wink at their grocer and see what they got. What they got was a free sample. In New York City alone, that single campaign multiplied sales by a factor of 15. He kept spending, kept advertising, kept hammering one word into the American mind over and over on billboards, in magazines, on the side of rail cars. Kellogg, not the flake, not the recipe, the name. He was not selling cereal. He was building a word, planting it in millions of heads until it meant one specific thing and nothing else. That is the part of this story that almost nobody notices, because it does not look like a machine the way a railroad or a brewery looks like a machine. But it was every bit as real and every bit as expensive to run. A patent protects an invention. It does not protect a name. And Will understood, whether he could have said it in those words or not, that the name was about to become worth more than the invention it was attached to. In 1906, the brothers finally split the businesses apart. John Harvey keeping the sanitarium and its associated food company, Will striking out on his own with a new venture, the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company. Both men, in their own ventures, kept using the word Kellogg. Both had a claim to it. Both had earned it in their own eyes. And for a few years, that overlap sat there, unresolved, a small crack nobody had bothered to seal. Then Will's advertising machine kept running, and the crack started to widen because every dollar he spent on those ads was quietly doing something more than selling boxes. It was moving the meaning of the word itself. Every year that passed, more Americans heard Kellogg and pictured a bowl of cornflakes on a breakfast table. Fewer and fewer of them pictured a sanitarium or a famous doctor in a white coat or a health resort in Michigan. The brothers were not just competing for customers anymore. Without either one fully realizing it, they were competing for a word. By 1910, both brothers had lawyers, and both had filed suit, each one claiming he alone had the right to put Kellogg on a box. The case dragged for a decade, through appeals, through settlements that fell apart, all the way up to the Michigan Supreme Court. And here is the part worth sitting with, because it tells you exactly what the court thought it was actually deciding. This was never framed as a question of who invented the flake. Nobody seriously disputed that John Harvey had done that work in his own laboratory. The question the court actually weighed was different. Who did the public believe when they heard the name? By the early 1920s, after millions spent on advertising, after 15 years of Will's face and signature on every box in every grocery store in the country, the answer was not close. Will's lawyers said it plainly in court. Everybody who hears the name Kellogg thinks of cornflakes now, and the judges agreed. Will won. John Harvey lost, and lost badly. He was ordered to pay the legal costs of the entire fight, and from that point forward, he was permitted to print his own name on a cereal box only in small type, tucked in a corner, a doctor's afterthought beneath his brother's giant signature. The two men, who had shared a kitchen, a laboratory, and a family name for decades, essentially stopped speaking to each other for the rest of their lives. Here is where the story quietly breaks from every other version of this pattern you have seen. This was never a tale about a fortune split too many ways and thinned into nothing. It is the opposite kind of trap. John Harvey did not lose because he shared too much. He lost because he assumed a title could substitute for a document. He was the famous one, the respected physician, the man patients traveled across the country to see, the one whose face and reputation had built the sanitarium's fame in the first place. It must have seemed for years obvious to him that a name so thoroughly his could never legally belong to anyone else. That assumption was the whole mistake. Fame is not a form of property. Reputation does not sit in a courthouse ledger. Only paperwork does that. And while John Harvey was treating patients and refining recipes in his lab, his brother was quietly and patiently filing exactly the kind of paperwork and building exactly the kind of public association that a court would later treat as ownership. The years after the ruling were not kind to what John Harvey had left. The sanitarium overextended itself with an ambitious new tower built against his own wishes in the late 1920s, right before the stock market collapsed under it. Guests stopped coming. Revenue dried up. In 1933, the institution was forced into receivership by a federal court, and by 1938, the doors of the once famous San closed for good, $3 million in debt. John Harvey Kellogg died in 1943 at 91 years old, having outlived the empire he built and the name he was no longer fully allowed to use. He was not a pauper. He had continued working, writing, and inventing to the end. But the institution that had made him famous was gone, and the name on the world's breakfast table was not, in any legal sense, his own anymore. Will Kellogg's ending looks, on the surface, like the opposite kind of story, and in one sense, it is. His company grew into one of the largest food manufacturers on the planet. Its box on breakfast tables in nearly every household in the country. And then, in 1930, he did something almost nobody expected from a man who had spent a decade in court defending every inch of his ownership. He gave nearly all of it away. $66 million, 97% of his entire net worth, went into a new foundation built to fund child welfare and public health. He kept a little over $2 million for himself to live on for the rest of his life, a fraction of what he could have held onto. He died in 1951, 8 years after his brother, having spent his final decades quietly emptying the very fortune he had fought so hard to secure. And there is a third man in this story worth remembering, the one who was never even family. Somewhere out there, on the same shelf as the Kellogg name, sits the legacy of the patient who could not pay his bill and worked it off in the sanitarium kitchen. Charles William Post built Postum, then Grape Nuts, then an empire that would eventually swallow Jell-O and Maxwell House and become General Foods. He had no legal claim to anything the Kellogg's owned, no family name to fight over, nothing but an idea he watched be born in someone else's kitchen and the nerve to build his own machine around it before anyone told him he could not. That fortune, built on a formula whose true origin is still disputed, passed down to his daughter, a woman named Marjorie Merriweather Post, who used it to build a winter palace on the coast of Florida called Mar-a-Lago. One kitchen, one flake, 3 men who touched it, 3 completely different endings, and if you have been paying attention, you already know where at least one of those endings led. So, what is actually sitting underneath this whole story once you strip away the family drama? It is not about brothers. It is not really even about cereal. It is about the difference between making a thing and owning the word attached to it. John Harvey Kellogg held the patents, ran the lab, and built the invention with his own hands. And none of that was enough, because a patent protects a formula and says nothing about a name. A name belongs, in the end, not to the person who thought of it first, but to whoever spends the most, defends it the hardest, and convinces the largest number of strangers that when they hear it, they should think of him. Will understood that without ever needing to say it out loud. His brother, the genius in the laboratory, never did, until a courtroom explained it to him in the plainest terms possible, and by then, it was already someone else's name. That is the quiet lesson sitting inside a cereal box that has been on breakfast tables for over 100 years. The invention was never the asset, the name was. And a name, unlike an idea, is never safe just because you were the one who thought of it first. There is a postscript to this story that the 2 brothers could never have imagined, and it closes the loop in a way almost too neat to invent. In 2023, nearly a full century after that Michigan courtroom decided who owned the word Kellogg, the company split itself in 2. The snack business, Pringles, Pop-Tarts, Cheez-It, took a new name, Kellanova, and walked away with the bigger, faster-growing half of the empire. What remained, the cereal business, the flakes and the loops and the frosted wheat, kept the old name. It even chose a new stock ticker to make the point, KLG, for Kellogg, the founder's own initials, stamped onto a corporation the way his signature was once stamped onto a box. It did not last. In 2025, both halves were sold, within months of each other, to companies that had never set foot in Battle Creek. Mars, the candy giant, bought Kellanova for close to $36 billion. And the smaller piece? The one that had gone to the trouble of putting Will Kellogg's own initials on its ticker symbol, the one built specifically to carry his name into a new century, was purchased for a little over $3 billion by an Italian confectionery company called Ferrero, founded in a small town in Piedmont just over 2 decades after Will had already won his case in court. So, the name that a Michigan court once ruled belonged to one brother, and not the other now belongs to neither. It belongs to a company headquartered an ocean away from the kitchen where the whole thing started, in a language neither brother ever spoke. The court decided who could put Kellogg on a box in 1920. Nobody in that courtroom thought to ask who would own the box itself 100 years later. That is, the part invention can never protect, and the part advertising, in the end, cannot either. Ownership is never permanent. It just changes hands more slowly than an idea does.